All right. Okay, we are live now. Welcome everybody to Protect PT's Community Lunch and Learn. I'm Jillian Graber, Executive Director of Protect PT, and we have here today with us Michelle Naccarati-Chapkis, and she is the Executive Director of Women for a Healthy Environment. She has been the Executive Director for about 15 years, and this Women for a Healthy Environment is a nonprofit organization that empowers underserved communities to build resilience, promote equity, and safeguard children from environmental health hazards. We collaborate with, or they collaborate with families, schools, and early learning centers to create healthy environments where children can flourish. Guided by science, they advocate for policies and programs that foster equitable lives free from environmental harm. So very much tied to what we work with or what we do here at Protect PT. So thank you so much, Michelle, for coming on today with us. And we're going to talk about Three Rivers 15 PFAS studies. So I'm going to let you take over and take it away here to talk about PFAS in our rivers.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you, and thank you for the invitation to spend some time this afternoon with Protect PT and your audience. This is an interesting study that we had done last summer as part of our environmental health fellow that was with the organization at the time. And when the fellow came on board, PFAS is something that our organization has been working on for several years now. And as it relates to being a forever chemical, it's persistent, it's bioaccumulative, it's toxic, it's in so many things as you'll hear about today. And so we wanted to get an understanding of PFAS in drinking water, and looking at PFAS in the water that is in our three rivers as a starting place, perhaps knowing that we might have some additional studies that would come out of this amazing work. So with that said, let's go to our first slide. So we looked at just the three rivers, knowing that we had a limited amount of time and a limited amount of funding in place for this work. And so we just wanted to get a sample. And so what we did was looked at the Allegheny, the River, the Ohio River, and the Monongahela to be a representative sample of the three rivers that we all know and love in our own backyards. And that is the source of major drinking water for many thousands and thousands of residents all across the county. And so the thing that we wanted to share with all of you is, let's get a little bit of a basic understanding about PFAS, because it's been in the news so much, and we can talk a little bit about why it's been in the news more recently, but it's becoming more of a mainstream discussion related to this particular synthetic chemical. PFAS is made up of thousands of different chemicals. And so it's the class of chemicals, of which there are many that fall under that. And so they have this persistent bond. You hear about long chain PFAS and short chain PFAS, and they don't necessarily break down naturally. And so that's why this, as we talk about them being a PBT, persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic, because it is so hard for them to break down over time. And essentially they don't go like plastics, right? They just don't break down. And so we need to now, as a community, everyone involved, federal government, state government, local government, community groups, all coming together to think about, the proper removal of PFAS, because at one point they were, incinerating PFAS. And so what did that do? Well, we know that impacted our air quality. So that wasn't a good solution. So PFAS is found on numerous applications. If you read something that's called stain resistant, water resistant, pretty good indication that you're going to have PFAS content there. As you can see in this graphic up above, it's in water resistant clothing. But, places like REI and Dick's Clothing Goods over the last couple of years have said, they have made a commitment. Us and many other organizations across the country had said, we can't have this in our merchandise. We can't have it in our camping gear or clothing gear. It must be removed. And so they've made commitments to removing PFAS from their merchandise. Paints, cosmetics, carpeting. So, stain resistant carpeting, pesticide applications. So as we think about pesticides, applying pesticides to our lawns, well, what we know that we use on our lawns gets washed down the drain, so to speak, right? It gets into our sewer system, and so impacting our ecosystem, certainly. We've given lots of discussions about PFAS and have given them onto college campuses, and it's sad to have to report to all of them that the microwave popcorn that they so rely on and use as a midnight snack, unfortunately, the lining of the microwave popcorn contains PFAS. Food packaging, and there's been a move to removing that. FDA has been working to remove PFAS from food packaging, so of concern and something to note. Certainly something in terms of upholstery, right? Stain resistant upholstery, same thing. Firefighting foam, your cookware. So, we want to make sure that people know about that. The cookware, it's better to get stainless steel and cast iron cookware, because a lot of this Teflon type of cookware can contain a type of PFAS. It might say PFTE free, it might say PFOA and PFOS free, but again, because there are so many different chemicals in the PFAS system, it could be replaced with something else that you don't necessarily know about. So if you have any Teflon at home, lesson learned, if it's scratched, please toss it out and don't use it, because any scratching in that Teflon coated cookware can leach into your food and cause harm. And again, personal care products and the firefighting foam, of which we had an incident right here in Allegheny County in McKeesport in 2021, where we had an incident where the firefighting foam backflowed into the water system, and the residents of the 10th Ward didn't have access to water, potable, non-potable, for up to 3 weeks. And so it was a very serious situation. Contamination of the system occurred, and now the Municipal Authority of Westmoreland County is suing 3M, DuPont, and the other makers of PFAS to get some funding back for the investment that had to be made to clean up that system. We want to ensure, though, I want to make note of that if any funding comes from that lawsuit, that it's put back into the community, those community members who were most impacted, to put in some measures in place to protecting them long term. Our organization had distributed water filters to all of the residents at that time of that particular incident. So again, forever chemical, bioaccumulative, and living organisms. So thinking about all of the aquatic life as well that we rely on that is impacted by PFAS. So next slide. So this is just a nice narrative to hone in on this particular study that we did. So our study looked at wastewater treatment plants as a particular potential source and what is happening in those species. And so as you can look at this is the cycle of PFAS. It's used in industrial sources. So thinking about a lot of industry up and down the three rivers that could be discharging into the stream, but discharging chemicals that could include PFAS. And so that's one of those things that I've been asking frequently is when you have to put in a permit for discharging, does it include PFAS into, listing specifically chemicals that are being discharged into the stream? So that's something that we want to know and learn and understand more about. Certainly, we talked about consumer products, household products, as you can see in the upper part of that graphic. We talked about agriculture and pesticide use. And in addition to that, looking at the firefighting foam. These are all of the different points and sources of PFAS contamination that are leading to a significant impact in terms of residents, consumers being potentially impacted by the exposure that we have. And so this particular study looked at wastewater treatment plants. And next slide, and we'll go to going to give a little bit of sense of health impacts as it relates to PFAS exposure. So ingestion, drinking water, that's why we studied what we did. That's the primary source of PFAS exposure is drinking water. And, you can go to, for instance, the Environmental Working Group has put together a map, ewg.org. You can go to their map and look at all of the PFAS contamination sites when they've done selective sampling all across the country. And Western PA, frankly, all of the Commonwealth is identified with different sources of PFAS contamination, especially, those places that have military and Air Force bases, training academies, firefighter training academies are hotspots for PFAS. So accidentally eating contaminated soil, this hand-to-mouth behavior, especially with children who are always constantly putting things in their mouth, wild-caught fish and game. I talked about the aquatic ecosystem that's impacted, and breast milk. We have seen how PFAS has been able to come through the mother in the breast milk to the infant. Skin absorption, less of an exposure, but some, and so that personal care product cosmetic issue is something of concern. And some states have actually passed bills to restrict PFAS in those products. And then inhalation. So our household dust, frankly, can be a very toxic space. And so making sure that you're wet dusting and wet mopping in your house frequently is a way to certainly suppress the exposure from that regard. Washing hands frequently. And then the aerosol PFAS from the proximity to manufacturing emission sources. So next slide. And so here are some of the health impacts from PFAS exposure. And this has all been shown through scientific study. There has been, no arguments in terms of knowing that by having PFAS exposure, our health is being impacted. And so that's why there's been such an emphasis on what we can do next, how we restrict its use, and how we get it out of the cycle of consumer product. So we have reduced immune system function that has been proven. We have reproductive and developmental health impacts. Liver damage. Various cancers have been associated with PFAS exposure, both thyroid disease and dysfunction, as well as then increased cholesterol levels, and inflammatory bowel disease, colitis. And one thing that isn't on here as well is that our body, as it relates to immune system impacts. So when we have vaccines that are needed for our health, there has been a scientific study that has said that our response to those vaccinations can be altered with PFAS exposure. And so that's something else that we want to make note of. Next slide. So just going back, I had mentioned this is the location. This is the actual scene of the fire that was happening at the auto body shop in the 10th ward of McKeesport. Fire breaks out. It is at an auto body shop. And so as you can think about all the things in an auto body shop, it's a lot of greases, it's a lot of lacquers, it's a lot of stains and paints and such that are really hard, difficult fires to fight. They called for backup. When the backup came in with the hazmat team, they had the PFAS, which is known as AFFF, that they used to put out the fire. Unfortunately, the way that it was hooked up to the hydrants, there was a backflow into the system and contaminated that water for a period of time. So our organization distributed the zero water filters, which has a charcoal filter in it to remove PFAS. We worked with the University of Pittsburgh with Dr. Carla Engie and her team at the Pitt Swanson School of Engineering, who have actually received NIH funding to continue doing some assessments and monitoring of the households that have been impacted by the PFAS exposure over time to ensure that the PFAS levels have been decreasing since the initial incident. Next slide. So here we're going to talk a little bit about the project itself. This is testing for PFAS contamination. And we looked at the wastewater effluent from the three rivers. As I mentioned, it's the Allegheny, Ohio, and Monongahela. Next slide. This is Morgan, our wonderful environmental health fellow. So Morgan took some sampling in working in collaboration with Three Rivers Waterkeeper. It was a wonderful collaboration between the two organizations. And so this shows you the various wastewater treatment plants where we looked at gathering the water sample at the effluent, the mixing zone of the wastewater treatment plant, and then collecting water sample upstream. And so here at the Allegheny River, we looked at the Allegheny Valley Joint Sewage Authority, which is up near Oakmont. You can see that red dot on your screen up near the Oakmont community. And then the Monongahela River, which is the one that's southern part of the diagram, and that's near McKeesport. It's the McKeesport Wastewater Treatment Plant. And then over by, as you see in between West Park and Bellevue on the furthest part, western part of this graphic, and this was the Aucassin, or the Allegheny County Sanitary Authority. Next slide. Okay, so 3 points, 3 locations. What did we do at each of those locations? We took, as I mentioned, an upstream sample about 15 meters upstream, and then we took a sample from the mixing zone. This is Morgan holding a picture of the cyclopore test kit, which has been used, and it's a great citizen science type of approach, but it's been used in a lot of different places. Three Rivers Waterkeepers using it in their studies that they're doing as well. And so we wanted to ensure the efficacy of this particular type of testing kit, and it works really well. What it does is, from the procedural side of things, there are many steps to mitigate the risk. And so we collected the sample from this HDPE bottle below surface interface. We poured that water sample into the cyclopore test kit after returning to shore, and then we waited for that sample essentially to filter out through, as you see, Dexorb, this pad for all the PFAS extraction. And so it looked at multiple different PFAS chemicals. As we mentioned, there are dozens and dozens of PFAS. And so it can settle all those out and sort and separate them. And then, of course, we used a field length to duplicate using validity of the results. So next slide. So here are the overall findings. There are stark increases, as you see, in the number of PFAS detected from the upstream sample to the mixing zone. And so if you look at each of these here on the side of the graph, it has the number of the PFAS detected in parts per trillion. And then down below, you'll see each of the different points for collection. So it's showing what's happening at Ohio River through Alcosan, AVJSA, and then at the McKeesport treatment plant. And so as you can see, the number of PFAS compounds detected, there's a higher number in the mixing zone as opposed to what's being shown upstream. And we'll talk a little bit about why we hypothesize that that's occurring. But in each instance, sometimes double, sometimes triple, sometimes even more than that, the numbers of PFAS chemicals that have been detected. So next slide. So here is the total PFAS in parts per trillion from the upstream sample to the mixing zone collection. And so the mixing zone, right, the slide before you was the upstream collection. This is the mixing zone, the effluent, right at the treatment plant. And so as you can see, again, similar to what we just saw before, but a significant amount of increase in the mixing zones compared to upstream. So here's the upstream sample of 3.7 at Alcosan and the total PFAS collected. So one is concentration, one is numbers of PFAS, two different things that we were looking at. So here it's 3.7 total PFAS. And in the mixing zone, 15.3 is the difference. Looking at Allegheny River, a 1.2 total PFAS. Again, looking at the mixing zone. Now this is significant, 36.1 in terms of parts per trillion in the mixing zone of the Allegheny River. And then looking at the Monongahela, 3.4 total PFAS, mixing zone 26.3. So what that's telling us is that in the mixing zone at the wastewater treatment plants, we have more PFAS being collected than what we're seeing upstream of each of these sites. And so, as we think about it, what we wash down the drain, what's getting into our wastewater treatment plants, A, is not being filtered. And B, all of those consumer things, that graph that we looked at the beginning of all those sources of PFAS, as well as the industrial sources, the other depiction that you saw where it's coming from so many different things. And, you all I know are focused heavily in the oil and gas industry and fracking operations. And we know that there's PFAS in that. And so what type of exposure is happening there in terms of what's getting into our groundwater. All of this contributes then to what we know is happening in our treatment plants that has to be better monitored and a system put in place for eventually ensuring that treatment occurs in the treatment plants for PFAS. Okay, yeah. Next slide.
And Michelle, really quick before we move on, you had mentioned that the filters. So the zero water filter that you mentioned earlier, that's a carbon filter.
The charcoal filter.
Yeah, the charcoal filter. Do you know what kind of filters the water treatment facility is using, and shouldn't those filters be adequate to filter out the PFAS?
So what this is telling us right now is that it is not right now. And I don't know if it's because it's the type of filtration that they're using, if there's no carbon filtration happening at those plants, or if it's a volume issue. And so that's something that we're now doing some inquiries with the wastewater treatment plants themselves to better understand the system and what that looks like in terms of, they have recognized. In fact, I talked with one representative from one of the wastewater treatment plants recently because we were spending some time in DC a couple of weeks ago sharing the results of this report and saying, these are significant findings, and this is just a small sample, knowing that we have, more monitoring has to occur. Actually, Michigan has a really great program that can be modeled very effectively, and that there has to be some funding put into this space because, we want to ensure that the ratepayer, the consumer, doesn't have to bear the burden and cost of upgrading these facilities. And so right now we're showing that frankly, they aren't adequately equipped right now for removing PFAS in all of its different forms from the treatment plant in terms of what gets washed and removed and put back into the rivers. And it's a need. It's a significant need, certainly, that we're seeing. And there has to be a concerted effort to be able to put that funding in place to be able to have access to upgrading those facilities.
Yeah, thank you for that. All right. Okay, go ahead.
So this is just some of the findings along the Allegheny River. As you'll look at, so as I mentioned many times, there are multiple different chemicals, synthetic chemicals that make up the class of PFAS. And so here are just some of them that are listed: PFHXA, PFOA, PFNA, PFDA, and the list goes on and on, right? So here is just a sampling then of how we got to the 36.1 parts per trillion. So this is showing you each of those PFAS chemicals upstream, what the detection level was, and then in the mixing zone to get the total PFAS as we had looked at in the previous graphics. And so just wanted to share that with you. That's how we got to the 36.1 in the Allegheny River. So PFOS is noted, and we'll get to in just a bit here, but the maximum contaminant level of 4 parts per trillion. And so that was something that was noted. Oh, sorry. I was just looking to see on this slide of PFOS. And so as you can see here, maximum contaminant level of 4 parts per trillion. But if you look in this graphic, and let me see if I can, actually, you have the screen, so I can't hover over. But it's the 1, 2, 3, fourth one up from the bottom, PFOS. And here it's 1.2 is the gray. Thank you. Yeah. So highlighting right there is the 6.9 is what we found in the mixing zone. As you can see up above now, 4.0 is the maximum contaminant level identified by the EPA. Okay, next slide. So we're in exceedance. That's the message that, that's what we need to see is that we are in exceedance. Here is some detail then along the Monongahela sample and what we were able to identify. And so PFOA, as you can see, 2.2, PFOS, 2.7, and then all of those various PFAS chemicals added in the mixing zone got us to the concentration of the 26.3 parts per trillion. Next slide. And this is just showing you essentially a snapshot from the EJ screen. So some of you may be familiar with EPA has an EJ screening tool. And so you can go to any parts of the country and put in different criteria selection to identify an environmental justice community in your neighborhood, in your vicinity. And so we looked at the EJ screen and wanted to see what was happening exactly in the 10th ward where this contamination occurred. And so as you can see, this is looking at the wastewater discharge as the criteria for this particular region. And so as you look at red is not good, it's the higher amount of discharge, and then the concentrations get more dispersed. But certainly, this is also something else that we want to raise people's attention to, is that this is an environmental justice issue. And as we see contamination in communities, as it relates to water contamination, air contamination, et cetera, this is happening in the communities that are identified as environmental justice communities that already have so many other burdens at play in their particular neighborhoods. Next slide. So these are the findings from the Ohio River sample. And as you can see, similar to the other graphs, again, PFOS is at 4.1, exceedance of the maximum contaminant level of 4.0. And then here are the total PFAS that we had detected, and then the maximum, the mixing zone levels of the 15.3. And that's how we got to that particular concentration level. Next slide. So let's talk a little about, in summary, of what we were able to find here to kind of wrap up the report. So what we have found are these stark increases in both the number of total PFAS in each of those 3 locations that were sampled. That increased in the mixing zone as opposed to what was being found upstream. So both the number of PFAS and the concentration of PFAS. And then as you saw, as we looked in those charts, there were 2 exceedances of the drinking water MCL, the maximum contaminant level, that were found here. Already knowing now that we are in violation, essentially, of what EPA drinking water levels are now. So 15 PFAS compounds were detected total. And this confirms that the wastewater treatment plants are a major source of PFAS contamination locally. So more studies have to be done. These are only 3 of the total of the water systems, wastewater treatment plants around the region. And so there are 26 of those all across Allegheny County, which is pretty significant in terms of numbers of wastewater treatment plants. But, the state and federal government has to take initiative and act quickly to remove PFAS from the supply chain and certainly from our environment, because what we are seeing, what we know is what we use and gets washed down the drain, gets into our rivers.
Yeah, and Michelle, we actually have a question comment on the screen. Costs should be borne by the companies utilizing PFAS.
Yep.
And reflected in the cost the product which they're using. Plastics and frac gas and all the rest are not as cheap as they seem. So
Right.
what I think what that viewer is talking about is really the economic side of it, which you touched upon a little bit earlier.
Right. We talked about that. Yep.
Really with the cost of upgrading the
Yeah.
the facilities, and it seems like if there's a time to do it, now's the time. I know there's a lot of federal funding available right now for
Absolutely. And
infrastructure.
there's good news that has come out of the EPA over the last couple of weeks that we can talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah.
So why don't we go to the next slide? I can see if I can see that. I'm trying to, is there a way to remove the comment at the bottom so that we can capture? Okay, there you go. Great, thank you. So putting our findings into perspective. So as I mentioned, these are the results for only 3 out of the 20, I said 26, I misspoke. 3 out of the 24 wastewater treatment plants identified all across Allegheny County. 3 Rivers Waterkeepers continuing to do this work. And so they'll be having a study that will be released, I think sometime this year, that will also, pick up all of the PFAS as we're talking about here. And as we mentioned, this is only one waste stream and doesn't account for this cumulative impact that we talked about when we started off the conversation this afternoon. From all of those other waste streams, including industrial discharges, including landfills and land application of biosolids of PFAS. So lots of different things. As you can see, the graphic again, it makes sense to show this once more because it is so well depicted for all the different multiple sources and how they all contribute to the larger system and the impact to drinking water quality. So many complex pathways for PFAS to get into the environment. So we need to have more studies, more data, but we know quite a bit already. And so now, I think it's time to take action. So next slide. What does that action look like? We talked a little bit about environmental justice in the earlier slide, and certainly research shows that communities of color are more impacted by PFAS contamination of drinking water, and that's due to the disproportionate proximity to PFAS users and emitters, as we talk about, those various industrial sources all upstream and downstream. As well as the proximity and location to waste discharge, industrial sites. Certainly the affordability of remediation and filtration. So the water filters that we were distributing cost on average about $50. And so, that's a burden because you've got to continue to replace the filters in order for the water pitcher to do its job. You've got to, continue to make sure that you're replacing that filter and that you've got a clean one in there. They're usually only good for about 3-month period. And then you're replacing that filter and getting another one. Some folks want to move to a reverse osmosis system, and that's very costly as well, several $100s. So all of these things that individuals would like to do are also, in some instances, cost prohibitive. And so the things that we're talking about here are the decision making that affects those downstream. Next slide. So here are some policy recommendations that we had been that are in the report and that we've been sharing with our elected officials, both at the federal level, as well as the state level. So regulating PFAS as a class of chemicals to avoid harmful substitutions. So there was the 21st Century Chemical Safety Act was passed in, I think, 2018, if I'm recalling correctly. And that was, essentially an amendment to the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA, which was written in 1976. TSCA hadn't been touched in decades since then. 85,000 chemicals have been introduced into commerce. 200 of them had been reviewed. It was so antiquated. It was not health protective. It wasn't helping residents, communities. It was really, unfortunately, putting a heavy burden on EPA and not the manufacturers of these chemicals. So the amendment, the Chemical Safety Act, really looked at then giving EPA the ability to better monitor, put more funding associated with looking at the introduction of any new chemicals, as well as then taking a back look to chemicals that have been introduced. And so in some instances, they're able to look at various classes of chemicals and get those studied for safety. We want the whole PFAS class to be identified as a class of chemicals, so that things like BPA, your guests may be familiar with BPA as an example, had been identified by the FDA as harmful and prohibited in children's products and wasn't allowed to be used anymore. But then BPA was replaced with BPS. And so scientific studies showed us that BPS was acting the same way. It was a hormone disruptor, an endocrine disruptor, and giving those same harmful impacts to human health as BPA did. And so wasn't helpful substitution. We don't want that to happen with PFAS. So identifying the whole class of chemicals is significant and something that's necessary and needed. We're calling for in this report to require wastewater treatment plants to monitor, to determine the sources of the environmental PFAS contamination, and then to target responses, to invest in sustainable chemistry. There's a lot happening in our own backyard at CMU, at the green chemistry program that they have, and others across the country are doing amazing work in this space. They need the funding to continue that work. Now, at the state level, there's lots of opportunities. So there was a state PFAS advisory board made up of all the deputy secretaries from all of the various departments at the state level. And so there's more action that needs to be taken at the state. So prohibiting the sale and distribution of PFAS in consumer products. There was a bill introduced, I believe, in the Senate just today that speaks to this consumer product PFAS call to action. Other states like California and Washington State have taken that lead. And I might even be able to pull it up while it's here. I will find it and move toward that so that you can all have it. It literally happened just a few hours ago. So we'll make sure that we get that to you. So that's, one of the things that our organization is calling upon and calling for is they're, making sure that PFAS is prohibited in all of these consumer products. And I am getting it. It is Senate Bill. Oh, no, I'm wrong. It's not Senate Bill. It's House Bill 2238 from Representative Greg Scott. So that's something that's moving, and everyone should keep an eye on that because that's really significant in terms of making sure that we don't have PFAS in these products. And it's been happening in other states. So it will be an easy way to comply essentially at the state level, because manufacturers are going to be required to do this in other states. And so they're not going to make, specific products for California, Washington to comply. The supply chain will be affected all across the country. Requiring and publicly disclosing the testing of the wastewater treatment plant influent and effluent to assess PFAS contamination. This is happening, as I mentioned, in Michigan. It's a really great example. Michigan's doing it really well. We should follow their lead and require that here at the state level as well, so that we have more scientific data. And frankly, the more data that we have, and we see this through our work at Women for a Healthy Environment, is a call to action. By collecting and monitoring this data, then we can say to our congressional leaders, we need the funding for this because we are able to demonstrate and show, the impact. And so certainly that's something that we know that, for instance, I had mentioned earlier the lawsuit that's underway with the Municipal Authority of Westmoreland County and many others. Frankly, there's a class action lawsuit, and so it's the manufacturers of PFAS, as I mentioned several of them earlier, who should be responsible for essentially the site cleanup of all of these things, the installation of filtration systems, because they all frankly knew that PFAS was a harmful chemical. And even though it may have been, ease of use of consumer products because of a stain resistant property or a water resistant property, it wasn't necessarily all beneficial to our health. So next slide. So here are some things as consumers that you can do as well to protect yourself. As we know, PFAS chemicals permeate our products and our foods, but there are some products that pose particularly higher hazards than others. And so limiting these exposures could lower your exposure. So we talked a little bit about various household products and avoiding stain-resistant carpets, furniture, and fabrics is important. So if you're in the market for any of those things, you could ask about if they are treated with stain-resistant, and that'll give you a pretty good clue about whether or not any type of PFAS is present. Avoiding purchasing clothing that's stain-resistant or waterproof, including things identified with Scotchgard or Gore-Tex, are good indicators. Again, there's been a commitment by 2 of our retailers to do that, but again, they have to work, whenever they make a commitment, it's not that it's going to happen tomorrow, but over time. So that might not happen until year 2025 or year 2026. So in the meantime, we still want to be cognizant of our purchases. As I mentioned earlier, if you've got any nonstick cookware, especially if it has any scratches in the surfaces, I would recommend tossing them out and instead using glass, stainless steel, and cast iron cookware. Avoid eating wild-caught fish from areas that are known to be contaminated with PFAS. Avoid the fast food packaging that is not confirmed to be PFAS-free. And then limiting consumption of pre-cooked and packaged foods. So, instead, the fresh and frozen foods. We are getting into farmers market season. This is a time to get out there and support your local farmers and to getting fresh foods. And then again, sorry to say, but avoiding that microwave popcorn bag. The good old fashioned kernels that you can cook over the stove are certainly fun and easy, and they're not in a PFAS bag. So drinking water. So there are water filters, as we mentioned, that do remove PFAS. And so you want to look for a filter that's NSF certified, like the Zero Waters that have the carbon filtration system in it that I mentioned earlier. And then looking for PFTE or fluoro as an ingredient in your personal care products. And if it has that, to avoid that. And then, as I mentioned earlier, EWG, the Environmental Working Group, has both the map of the drinking water contamination across the country for PFAS, but it also has a nice safety database for cosmetics and other personal care products. Next slide. So that is the end of our slides, but I did want to mention that the EPA has taken significant steps over the last couple of weeks. And so it identified PFOA, PFOA, and PFOS as hazardous substances. And so where that has been found, it can fall into a Superfund site for mitigation and cleanup contamination. And so that's something that has been that just happened in the EPA more recently. And so that's something that is important to note, is that the EPA is taking action at least on those 2 particular PFAS chemicals. And then in addition to that, the EPA has taken action for the first time in 28 years on updating its drinking water standards. And so as it relates specifically to the Safe Drinking Water Act, and looked at 6 PFAS chemicals and assigned maximum contaminant levels to those. And so that's something else that has just happened. And your water utilities, the water authorities, are going to have to be monitoring and testing for PFAS, and including that in their consumer confidence reports. And so as the viewers are thinking about, understanding what could be happening locally in their own water authority and their own drinking water system, they'll be able to now going into 2025. There's a period of time for compliance, but we'll be able to go into the consumer confidence report that hopefully is posted online, and download that report and look at what the readings are for PFAS, multiple different PFAS chemicals. PFOA and PFOS are going to be included in that. And so those are all positive changes that have happened by the EPA over the last several weeks that I wanted your viewers to note, because there is action being taken, but there's a lot more work to be done. And so, we can all use our voices, collective voices, to talk about what the needs are at the state level, passing things like this House bill that had just been introduced today, getting people excited about that and wanting to take action and move forward with those types of laws that are more health protective and prohibiting PFAS from, the exposures that we know exist in consumer product. So with that, I will stop.
Thank you, Michelle. That was great. Yeah, a lot of good next actions for folks, a lot of good information about what people can do to limit PFAS exposure in their lives. I do have a question for you. So if someone wants to get involved specifically in the policy talks, and what are some recommendations that you have for folks that really want to get involved in that side of things?
Yeah, they can certainly reach out to us and our policy team, and we will, we are always looking for volunteers to help raise the awareness and to start communicating that, in terms of what the messaging can be to their elected officials. And so with this just happening today with House Bill, there are some other bills that we're working on related to PFAS exposure, making certain that you're checking the website, reaching out to the info at button, and we can connect you with the policy advocacy team, and they can make sure that folks are informed and updated. The call to actions that we'll be putting out are all really, really helpful, especially at the state level, in terms of being able to have districts right in our own communities where we can talk to the staffers, and we don't have to go to Harrisburg. We've got people right in our own backyard that we can knock on the door and spend some time and say, here's a fact sheet of why PFAS is so terrible and the health impacts that we know. And, we want you to support these various bills that are coming before you.
That's great. Okay. And I also put that information in the chat, in the broadcast. So no matter where you're coming in from, you'll be able to get to the Women for Healthy Environment.
So I would just say, let's check that one link that you have, because today's introduction was at the state level.
Okay.
And so that might be.
Yeah, I looked that up at the state.
You looked it up? Was it right? Okay.
I didn't see that was the correct.
Might be so new that it's not even there.
Yeah, maybe it is so new. This one that I looked up here, once I saw that, this one says Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act of 2021.
Oh, that's still the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act is actually a really great bill to have everybody here support as well. So keep it in the chat. I don't remove it, because that is a really great federal bill that we need our electeds to be supporting.
Yeah.
Thank you. Awesome.
When I looked it up at the state level, a few things came up, but it didn't look like it was PFAS related. So I was just trying to do it while we're talking.
That is why it's so hot off the press, right? No.
That's right. Okay, so yeah, and then so I have your website up, and then definitely.
Thank you. There are policy briefs too that they can go to on the website. So if you go under Take Action, under the We Reports, this is where the full report is for this particular study that was done. And then in that, there are also policy briefs. And so we've got a PFAS policy brief that folks can access to, that shows you, some of the specific recommendations that we're talking about here.
Oh, great. That is amazing. Yeah. And you guys do such amazing work. I mean, I know you guys work on, lead issues and radon issues, particularly radon in schools. So, keep up the good work.
Thank you. Thanks, Marin, for the shout out.
Marin's watching here. So yeah, and I hope other people watch in the future. If you couldn't join us here on the lunch side of things today, thank you, Emily. Emily, thank you for your tech in the background. And yeah, thanks for tuning in, folks. Just let you know, our next Lunch and Learn is going to be May 28th. Whoops. Thank you. And we're going to be talking about frackonomics and is it worth it with Dr. Todd Potts. So please join us then. We're going to be streaming live on YouTube again. Thank you so much, Michelle, for all this
Thank
wonderful
you.
information to bring to people to try to limit our exposure to PFAS as much as possible and advocate for new policies going forward. So I hope
Absolutely.
everybody,
Thank you.
can take a lot out of this conversation, and have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Take
Bye.
care.